Hello.
Hi.
My name is Christina West. I'm from the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really interested in your NPO, the Arctic Circle. So it's very fascinating to me. And you spoke of Iceland making free trade agreements with China, and you were the first European country to do so. And I have seen that there's been some backlash from the Arctic Council, and with some concerns of your involvement involving China in the Arctic, and I see it being a positive role. But how do you respond to that backlash?
Well, I think it's putting it too strongly to say that there's been some backlash or criticism from the Arctic Council. For those of you who don't know, the Arctic Council is the intergovernmental body of the 8 Arctic countries: Russia, United States, Canada, and the 5 Nordic countries. And it's actually very interesting that in the last 20 years, since the Arctic Council was created, that despite conflicts in other parts of the world, like over Ukraine or Syria or other parts, the United States and Russia have cooperated very constructively in the Arctic Council, created agreements like the science agreement that was signed in the United States a year ago at the end of the US chairmanship. But in 2013, because the Arctic Council also has a system of observer states, they agreed to accept China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and a few others as observer states. But the problem is, in the structure of the Arctic Council, they are not allowed to speak. France and Germany are also observer states. And my good friend, the late Michel Rocard, former Prime Minister of France, who was appointed first by Sarkozy and then by Hollande as the representative of the President of France to the Arctic, said very memorably in Paris a few years ago, when he was discussing this problem, that France attended the meetings of the Arctic Council but was never allowed to speak. And he added unforgettably this sentence: France is not accustomed not to be allowed to speak. But in the Arctic Circle, as I described before, we created a platform where everybody, whether you are China and Japan or you are an activist, or any of you, can come to the assembly and participate. So we provided a platform where China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, India, France, Germany, Poland, Switzerland, and the others can come and present their case on the Arctic. Why should China and Korea or Japan be interested in the Arctic? There are a few obvious reasons. One is that the extreme frequency of bad weather in Asia is largely caused by the melting of the Arctic seas. Secondly, as I said before, if the Greenland ice sheet melts, it will destroy most coastal cities in Japan, Korea, and China. Thirdly, there are new sea routes going through the north, linking China, Japan, Korea to Europe in a completely new way, almost as revolutionary as the Suez Canal was when it was built. And then also, for any major economy in the 21st century, the Arctic is very rich in materials. And then I'm not talking about oil and gas, I'm talking about rare metals and other materials necessary for the iPhones, the computers, and the other aspects of the information technology. So these Asian countries have in many ways a legitimate role in the dialogue on the future of the Arctic. And now the Arctic Council has come to recognize that this dynamic relationship between the intergovernmental body of the 8 Arctic states and the international platform of the Arctic Circle, where every October in Iceland over 2,000 people from more than 60 countries come together, is a very good formula in order to secure a constructive and responsible global cooperation on the Arctic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, Excellency. Thank you so much for your comprehensive speech. My name is Damien. I'm from Indonesia. I have one question. Actually, there's supposed to be 2, but you already answered for the free trade with China. But my first question will be about the soft power and the global warming, because there is some introduction about the global warming also in Iceland. Just want to ask you that, could you please share with us on how Iceland counter this issue between soft power and also the cultural diplomacy with the global warming as a future trends? And because this is also impacts is not only with the environment but also with the tourism and other sector. Thank you so much, sir.
Well, Iceland has, as many of you might know, the largest glaciers in Europe. They are also the most studied glaciers in the world. So we now have a very extensive scientific record of how fast these glaciers have melted. And we even have cameras which you can connect to on your mobile phone as we speak, which shows you how the glaciers continue to melt. And when the President of France came to Iceland in October of 2015, a few months before the Paris climate negotiations conference, before he spoke at the Arctic Circle Assembly, I took him, flew him up in a helicopter to one of our fastest retreating glaciers. He had never been to a retreating glacier of this kind before. And instead of letting the helicopter land at the edge of the glacier, I let the helicopter land where the glacier was when I was born. And I then let President Hollande walk in the rain over the black sands and the rocks and so on for more than half an hour over this area that had emerged from the melting of the glacier. And then when he came to the glacier, my wife took out a piece of ice from the water so he could see the aggressive melting taking place, and that picture actually made the headlines in many of the French newspapers. So I often say Iceland is the best demonstration place in the world for, on the one hand, how the ice is melting and the impact that has on the entire planet, but also for the solution, because we demonstrate that it's possible in a relatively short time, meaning 30, 40 years, to move away from oil and coal over to clean energy and make a great economic success of that transformation. And as most of you might know now, solar power is cheaper than oil. Wind power is cheaper than oil. I have recently agreed to chair a new geopolitical commission set up by IRENA. We had our first meeting in Berlin about a month ago to study the effect on global politics when oil gives away to renewable energy. And the essence of renewable energy, as you might know, whether it's solar, wind, biomass, geothermal, or other forms, you can engage in that transformation in your household, in your village, in your district, in your town, in your region, or in your country. It is the democratization of energy beyond anything we could have expected, because we were all brought up with big companies, energy companies, whether they were utility companies or energy production companies, dominating the scene. Renewable energy is beautiful in the sense that anybody can do it and benefit from it without necessarily being dependent on large corporations or other entities. So I think Iceland's major contribution to the climate change discussion is, first of all, to demonstrate what's happening, because I sometimes say, especially in America, where you meet a lot of people who don't yet accept climate change, I say the ice is neither Republican or Democratic. The ice is neither right or left. It's simply melting. And there are three big ice-covered areas in the world. One is Greenland, half the size of Western Europe. And just think about it, as I said before, if just a quarter of the Greenland ice would melt, it would mean 2 meters rise in sea levels all over the world. It will mean many island states will completely disappear. If you take Kiribati, for example, in the Pacific, the highest point in Kiribati is 3 meters. It's the highest point. Famous cities like Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Singapore, Shanghai will not be livable in the present form, in that kind of condition. And also, we show others that the transformation over to renewable energy makes a great economic sense. You don't do it because you believe in climate change has to prevent it. You do it because it benefits your economy, it benefits your community. And now we are engaging in such cooperation with many different parts of the world. We have, for example, 2 training programs in Iceland that are part of the United Nations University. One is the Geothermal Training program, which has trained over 600 experts from developing countries, mainly Africa and Asia, in using the geothermal resources. The other is the soil preservation and the soil reclamation program, because Iceland is also the biggest desert in Europe. And we are bringing people from Africa and other parts of the world learning how to combat the desert as a part of the climate change solutions.
Thank you, Excellency.
Mr. President, sir.
Yeah.
It's an honor to sit beside you right now. I feel so happy and privileged, sir. My question is simple. I think all this success we will hear and learn about Iceland is very fascinating, and it's worked because it was practicalized and we see how everything worked out. But what about countries which have like more people and crisis already? Because I think Iceland doesn't have too many people and too many crises. What about countries like my country that has different issues, crises, and all that? How will you advise smart power in this case?
Well, it's a very important question, because often when I present this analysis or talk about clean energy or climate change and the transformation of our country, people say, yeah, you can do that in Iceland, you're small, you're there, that, and so on and so forth. Well, let's go back to the time when we were born, Ögmundur and I. That's not a long time ago. I mean, we might look a bit old, but it's not that long time ago. Then Iceland was the poorest country in Europe. The poorest country in Europe. It was a country of farmers and fishermen. The British, the French, the Belgium, and the other trawlers fished up to 3 miles of the Icelandic zone. When we expanded to 4 miles, the British put a trade embargo on us. That was tougher than the sanctions against Russia today. When we expanded to 12 miles, they sent the British Navy trying to stop us. When we expanded to 50 miles, they sent the Navy again. The only international organization that supported us at that time was the African Union. And they did the same thing when we expanded to 200 miles. And I'm not telling you this in order to be anti-British. I mean, both of us were educated in Britain. And I'm married to a woman who has lived most of her life in Britain. So, I mean, I am as pro-British as you can possibly be. But it doesn't change the historic fact that our success was against the odds. In the beginning of the 20th century, we were only 100,000 people. There were no bridges, no roads, no modern hospitals, very few schools. In a country the size of England, because if you take Scotland and Wales away and you just leave little England, it's about the same size as Iceland. And then think about it for a moment. For 100,000 people to create the infrastructure in this size of territory, like building roads all over England, building airports, building harbors, building schools, building hospitals, sending students abroad to have education, like both of us and others. It's an extraordinary example of an achievement through the democratic and economic will of a power, and has nothing to do with size, in my opinion, because most people would have said 50 years ago or 60 years, 70 years ago, it's not possible. It's not possible for such a small entity to achieve this economic success. And when we suffered the financial crisis, there were many who said, yeah, hey, this proves that a small country is not a viable economic entity in the modern globalized world. There were many who said that. That the financial crisis, the collapse of the Icelandic bank showed that you had to be either a part of a big entity like the European Union, or you had to have a big financial system like Britain or France or Germany in order to survive. But throughout, as I said before, I could describe that at great length, so could my good friend here, we proved that that's not the case as well. And that is why in the beginning of my talk, I emphasized to all of you the extraordinary global transformation in the last 50 or 60 years in the multitude of small and medium-sized countries that have been created and become independent. Because the lessons of my country is an example of it is possible, it's doable. You can take a number of other countries. In the scale of things, Norway, Sweden, and Finland are not large countries. Sweden has about the same population as Quebec in Canada. Norway is far smaller than most of the African countries. I know they like to think of themselves as very big players in a European setting, but they are basically small in the terms of the population or even the geographical location. But it's very interesting. If you take the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, even their combined strength, about 30 million people or so, is small on a global scale. I used to meet, when I was president, delegations from China. And the foreign ministry sometimes told me, you're meeting a regional leader from China, until I realized that he represented a region of 70 or 80 million people. That's bigger than France or Germany. So the whole history of the Nordic countries, not only my country, but also the other 4 or 5 Nordic countries, is also a proof that smallness in the global sense does not prevent you from achieving social, economic, and democratic and judicial excellence.
So that will conclude our panel with Mr. President. So round of applause again. Thank you.
Okay.